Alister McGrath is a man with 3 doctorates. One in molecular biophysics, which sounds really cool. One in theology, sounds very deep, of course. And one in intellectual history, sounds really intellectual. And they're all from the University of Oxford. So I'm telling you all this, not to make myself feel totally inadequate this evening, but to say that actually, if you think about it, Alister is uniquely positioned to tackle the issues, the theme of tonight's lecture. God, science, and the meaning of life. That is a lecture on science and religion through the lens of 2 really famous Oxford professors, C.S. Lewis, an apologist for the Christian faith, and Richard Dawkins, an apologist for atheism. So tonight, you're in for a treat. You're in for an authoritative intellectual treat. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, Alister McGrath.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying what a huge pleasure it is to be here with you tonight, here in Hong Kong, and talk about this big question, God, science, and the meaning of life. I'm going to begin by focusing on this question of the meaning of life, and then we'll begin to open it up and see how both Lewis and Dawkins feed into this. And obviously, I'll be telling you what I think, but in many ways, the purpose of this lecture is to say, this is a really interesting question, what do you think? And use this information to kind of way develop your own way of thinking. So let's begin by thinking about this quest for meaning. What is it? Why is it so important? And some of you will know the British novelist Jeanette Winterson, and you may have read this book, which has a wonderful title. I wish I'd thought of that. Why be happy when you could be normal? Well, what a good question. But look at what she says here. She says, we cannot simply eat, sleep, hunt, and reproduce. We are meaning-seeking creatures. And that really is the theme I'll be teasing out tonight. Why is meaning so important to us? What does meaning mean? And how do science and religion feed into this attempt to understand our world and, of course, ourselves? So it's a really interesting question. That's why so many of you are here tonight. And I hope that as we explore this, you'll find this really interesting in thinking through some of these questions. So what does this word meaning mean? So here's a psychologist, in effect, not telling us what the meaning of life is, but rather saying to us, here are the sorts of things that this word meaning begins to open up. Meaning, he writes, is about the extent to which people comprehend, make sense of, or see significance in their lives, accompanied by the degree to which they perceive themselves to have a purpose, a mission, or an overarching aim in life. And my guess is most of you have thought about these things already. And this is really why there's such a major question, because it's not just how does our world work, but it's about how do I fit into it? Is there a bigger picture of which I am part? And in many ways, that helps us to understand why these questions matter so much to people. But of course, we need to unpack that word meaning. What might the elements of this be? Now, clearly, there are different versions of this, but this is how one social psychologist will begin to unpack this. The first major theme is the question of identity. Who am I? In other words, what is special about me? And again, that is important in an era when very often people get dehumanized or depersonalized. What is special about me? And how do I safeguard that? Then, of course, this deep question of purpose. Why am I here? Now, science is very good at telling us how we came to be here. But when it comes to the question, why? That's different. And this issue of purpose, this deep feeling, each of us is special, each of us has something maybe we're meant to be doing. Now, for many of you, that will be a really important question. You'll be asking yourself, what am I meant to be doing with my life? And here's a third element, efficacy. That means, in simple language, can I make a difference? Is there something that I can do that really is significant and of value? And again, that's important. But for many of you, I think the final element's important. It's the whole issue of self-worth. And it's this deep, troubling question, do I really matter? And of course, the answers to these questions are really important. And it's all part of this bigger human quest for meaning. So where would we find answers to these questions? Well, of course, one answer would be in philosophy. And I want to say that classical philosophy of the Greek classical period really did try to engage these issues. But in more recent times, philosophy seems to have disengaged from this. And this is the American philosopher Susan Wolf, her essay, The Meaning of Lives, which is really worth reading. It's very short, very compact, full of wisdom. But she says that in her experience as a professional American philosopher, the whole question of the meaning of life isn't really discussed or even taken seriously in philosophical circles these days. And she writes that the people who ask these questions tend to be seen as naive young students whose lack of sophistication causes professional philosophers to cringe with embarrassment. But of course, her point is this is a real question and it really matters. And the problem is that professional philosophy doesn't seem to think it's that worthwhile anymore. And she writes that talk about life having any meaning, even before you get on to the question of what that meaning might be, has, in her words, been banished from philosophy. Now, it may have been banished from philosophy, but it's not banished from each of us, because we regard these questions as being important and relevant. So where else might we look? And here, of course, we begin to touch on the importance of religion. Because although religion is very difficult to define in many ways, one of the things it does is to try and articulate a framework of meaning about who we are, what we're meant to be doing, why we matter, and fit us into a bigger scheme of things. So this is Robert Emmons talking about this whole question of what meaning is and how religion feeds into this. He writes, religion can provide us with a comprehensive and integrated framework of meaning that helps to explain many worldly events, experiences, and situations, while providing a way of helping individuals to transcend their own concerns or experience and connect up with something greater. And maybe that final couple of words there really matters. It's about realizing that we are part of something bigger, and that this something bigger is really important in figuring out how the world works and what we find in our own place within it. So in many ways, that's our topic tonight, looking at this whole question of meaning and beginning to figure out how religion might fit into this. So how does religion feed into this human quest for meaning? And to make this more interesting, you could listen to me, but it's much more interesting to hear other voices. I thought I would bring two Oxford voices here with me tonight. When I say voices, I mean their ideas are going to be represented. Unfortunately, I can't either magic them here or indeed even provide recordings of them, but I can certainly put their ideas on the table and we can explore them. They're both well-known Oxford thinkers. They are at opposite ends of the spectrum, but that means they give us food for thought as we reflect on this question of meaning. And the really important thing I want to say is this, that in this lecture tonight, I can open up these questions. And sure, I'll tell you what I think, I'll tell you what Lewis thinks, I'll tell you what Dawkins thinks, but as I was saying earlier, what really matters is what you think. And in many ways, this lecture is about opening up these questions for reflection and discussion. So let's talk about our two dialogue partners. There's Richard Dawkins. Many of you will know him or have read of him. He was, until his retirement, Professor of the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford. And he wrote a number of books, and the ones that stand out for me, certainly, are that 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, and his book, The God Delusion. And certainly when I myself was doing research in science, I did a first degree in chemistry at Oxford, and then I did research, as you're being told, in molecular biophysics. And while I was doing that research, The Selfish Gene appeared. And I read that book with great interest, but in many ways, the book that has generated most discussion appeared 30 years later, and it's The God Delusion. And that will be impacting on our discussion tonight. Lewis, of course, is very different. Lewis is a professor of medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge, although he spent most of his career at Oxford. His books include Mere Christianity and Surprised by Joy. And these people are interesting, A, because they write very well, B, because they develop really interesting ideas, but C, because they have very different life trajectories. So let's look at these. Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist who moved from a childhood Anglicanism to his developed, mature atheism. Whereas Lewis, of course, read classics in English at Oxford and then moved from his childhood atheism to what he called mere Christianity. What does he mean by that? He means a kind of Christianity that draws on the richness of the Christian faith without entailing any specific denominational commitment. So it's a curious approach. Lewis himself was an Anglican, but in effect he said what is more important than any denomination is what they hold in common, and he calls that mere Christianity. So let's look at 3 questions which are opened up by these thinkers. And I hope you'll find these interesting, and I hope you'll find my reflections useful as you yourself begin to look at this. And the first question is this: is religious faith reasonable? It's a very good question. And of course, Dawkins and Lewis, obviously in making these life trajectories and decisions, basically are doing so on a set of some beliefs. And for Dawkins, you only believe what can be proved by reason or science. In other words, it's about insisting that everything that we accept as true can be demonstrated to be true. There is no room for faith because, in effect, you have certainty. You're able to say, this is right. Therefore, there is no need for faith because it's right, it's known to be right. And therefore, there's no, I believe this to be right, because you know it to be right. Whereas Lewis was much more tentative. He said that most of the really important things in life, the big ideas about God or moral values, lie beyond rational or scientific proof, and we have to learn to live with that. Now, that's a very interesting position. And so we're going to begin by exploring this and seeing where it takes us. Dawkins is very, very clear that faith is simply running away from evidence. For example, this quote, which I'm sure many of you will know: faith means blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. And at one point, he even goes as far as to say that faith is a kind of mental illness, though I think he perhaps regrets saying that now, but he certainly did back in the 1980s. Now, here is Dawkins writing in The Selfish Gene and talking about why faith is not necessary in science. So I'm going to read this to you, then ask you to reflect on whether you think he's right. Faith, he writes, is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. And that same approach to faith, to evidence, lies, of course, behind his later book, The God Delusion. Now, this is a very influential position. It underlies the new atheism, and it's very much this view: what you see is what you get. You only buy into what can be proved to be true, and what can be proved to be true, well, there's no need for faith, because it is compellingly obvious that it is right. Therefore, we can limit reality to what reason and science can prove. But my question to you tonight is whether this actually is right, and whether actually it might be a little bit more complicated than Dawkins is allowing. Dawkins is a wonderful scientific popularizer, but the danger of popularizing is that you oversimplify. And so let me therefore complexify this and just suggest it's not quite that straightforward. Dawkins argues if there were good supporting evidence for something, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. Now, those of you who are scientists, I'm going to suggest to you that actually the evidence may suggest certain things, but it doesn't always compel us to believe them. It opens up lines of inquiry, but very rarely are we absolutely compelled to say there is only one right explanation, because we have this phenomenon of multiple explanations for any given set of observations. And what I want to do is look at a distinction which Dawkins doesn't make, but should have made. And you'll remember that in that quote I gave you, he talked about the total absence of supporting evidence. And I think he needs to ask, what about the absence of totally supporting evidence, which is something quite different. In other words, what you're saying is faith is not about the total absence of supporting evidence, but rather is a judgment on the basis of evidence that does not compel you to accept A, B, C, or D, that A or B or C or D is the best explanation of those observations. And those of you who are into philosophy of science will know this debate about the best explanation, the criteria you might use, and how rare it is to find a scientific situation where unequivocally you can say, that is the answer, we are compelled to that. There's a much greater openness, I think, than Dawkins is allowing. For example, proof, many would say, is really limited to the realms of mathematics and logic, but these are self-contained systems which very often don't impact on the decisions you and I make in real life. To give you one example, which I think helps make this point clear, those of you who are interested in cosmology will know there is a massive debate about whether there is simply a single universe or a raft or bubble of universes that we call the multiverse. And of course, the evidence is there, partly pointing one way, partly pointing the other way, but conclusively pointing nowhere. And yet scientists will make judgments. They will say, we think that it's a single universe because, but they will then be careful. We believe this is the best explanation, in brackets, but we know we can't prove it. Whereas otherwise, others will say, no, no, it is the multiverse. We believe that's right, but again, in brackets, we know we can't prove that. So what I'm suggesting is maybe science isn't quite as straightforward as Dawkins suggests. And it's not simply that there are, at this moment in time, situations where you have multiple explanations, each of which has reasons for support, but also we have the phenomenon of theory change in science. And again, many of you will know all about this. This is where you have a consensus which is stable for a while and is then eroded, and a new way of thinking begins to emerge. And those of you, again, who know something about cosmology will know that if we were to meet here in Hong Kong, let's say 150 years ago, and ask, what is the contemporary scientific understanding of the origins of the universe? Well, we just wouldn't be having that conversation, because at that time the consensus was the universe has always been here. That religious language about creation just doesn't mean anything. Whereas, of course, now things have changed quite radically. And we have this whole theory of the Big Bang, the universe coming into existence. And that is a radical theory change in science. And the problem many of us face is this: given that major change, what other major changes might lie ahead in the future? What Thomas Kuhn called paradigm shifts. So science is wonderful, it's rational, but nevertheless we're very often left saying, on the basis of the evidence available, the best way of making sense of it is this. But all too often we have to say, but we can't show that that is right, and it may be that we have to move on to something else in the future. Now, Lewis is interesting on this point. Lewis described himself in a very interesting unpublished article of 1930 as an empirical theist who came to faith through induction. What's that about? It's about Lewis, in effect, saying that what persuaded him that the God idea made so much sense was that if you take that as an interpretative lens, in other words, if you look at the world and look at yourself through that intellectual framework, it seems to bring things into focus. It seems to give you a way of looking at things which makes sense of things. And Lewis basically is arguing that he discovered that the God idea made sense of more than the non-God idea. Now, Lewis, of course, initially was an atheist. And we know there are two reasons why he took that decision. First of all, he took the view that science necessarily entailed atheism. And certainly when I myself was younger, when I was about 16 or 17, studying science at high school, knowing I wanted to be a scientist, it just seemed to me very, very obvious that science had the answers, and these could be proved to be true, and that meant that there was no place for stuff like God, because that just couldn't be shown to be right. And anyway, science gave you an explanation which made all of that completely irrelevant. So Lewis took a very similar view in his youth, but he also felt that suffering was a major issue, which caused major difficulties for believing in God. And some of you will know Lewis served in the British Army in World War I. He was very seriously wounded. And one of the things that went through Lewis's mind repeatedly is, if there is a God, why is there this war taking place? That in effect, the existence of this war, its destruction, its complete pointlessness is a sign that there is no God. And certainly for a while, Lewis found that very persuasive. But then he began to realize that actually it wasn't quite that straightforward. Because if there is no God, then you cannot blame God for the war, and you have to blame human beings instead. And Lewis found that a very unsettling thought, because at that stage he took the idea that human beings were simply good all the time, and therefore they couldn't do bad things like end up in wars. So in many ways he found that this was an unsettling line of thought. But there was something else, and this goes back really to that big question I raised right at the beginning of this talk. In the mid-1920s, Lewis seemed to be settled in his atheism. But it's almost as if he was saying, well, look, this might be right, but it doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't actually give me a reason to live. It doesn't energize me intellectually or spiritually. And we find this in a number of points in his writing. And perhaps this quote from Surprised by Joy, which as many of you will know is his spiritual autobiography, captures his unease about his atheism. Let me read it to you and then explain what he's saying. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. And you see Lewis here caught, this is the world that I think I can prove is there, and it's grim, it's meaningless. But something within me is saying there is a bigger world, a world, as you can see, which is all about poetry, myth in Lewis's sense meaning a big story that really makes sense of things. And Lewis found himself thinking thoughts like, I wonder if that might be true, if my deepest intuitions are actually moving me in a different direction. So Lewis basically came to faith in Christianity, and we know why. Because Lewis, in effect, at many points sets out this idea that Christianity gives a big picture, and he argues that it is to be evaluated by its ability to fit in what he observed in the world around him and what he experienced within him. And he summarizes this in what I think is one of his best quotations, and some of you will know this. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And I'd like you just to visualize the imagery that Lewis is using. Lewis is asking us to imagine that we're standing on a mountain peak, looking down before dawn on a dark landscape shrouded in mist. And as the sun rises, then the landscape gets lit up, the mist begins to evaporate, we begin to see further and more clearly than we otherwise could. And so for Lewis, the capacity of Christianity to make sense of things was an indication of its truth. So two very different perspectives there. Now what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to take Dawkins very, very seriously. And I want to say Dawkins is absolutely right when he says that we need to provide reasons for our beliefs. Dawkins will be a very powerful critic of what we call post-truth, the idea that you simply invent reality. Dawkins is very, very clear. You need to give reasons for what you think to be right. But I want to suggest to you, and leave this to you to think about, that Dawkins is wrong to think that we can prove everything that we believe. And to help us think this through, I'm going to do a thought experiment. But let me begin by giving you a quote from the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell. This is Russell in the preface to his book, A History of Western Philosophy. I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to notice how, in effect, Russell is saying, look, we have to live with uncertainty because we can't prove the things that really matter to us. Here's how he puts it. Philosophy helps us, I quote, to live without certainty and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. Now, if Dawkins is right, the dilemma doesn't arrive because you only just believe in stuff that can be proved. But Russell is saying that's just not what's happening. We end up, in effect, making judgments about what's right, what can be trusted, which we can't prove to be true, but that doesn't mean we end up being paralyzed by hesitation. Another Oxford figure, so Isaiah Berlin, made this point very, very clearly in a number of essays when he asked, let's imagine all the things that people believe, and they can fall into three broad categories. Those that you can establish by science, those you can establish by logic, and those you can't prove in either of those ways. Now, that's fairly straightforward, but what is interesting is his analysis. And his argument is that every belief about life that gives us meaning and purpose falls into the third of those categories. In other words, that whether you have political or social or moral or religious or anti-religious views, those fall in the third category. They can't be proven. They are judgments, they're opinions. There may be good reasons thinking they're right, but you are not compelled to the conclusion that they're right. And the British literary critic Terry Eagleton makes this point rather nicely in a review of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, when he writes, we hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. I think I need to translate this into simpler English. So what he's saying, I think, is that you and I believe a lot of stuff that we cannot prove to be right. But hey, it's okay to hold these ideas because we have reasons to think they're right. In other words, not proof, but justification, for those of you who know that philosophical distinction. So again, let's do this thought experiment. I want you to imagine that you only accept ideas that can conclusively and decisively be proved to be right. Okay, you get the idea. So this means we need to ask, what sort of world would that be? Now, here are some ideas you could accept. These are, I think, completely unproblematic. 2 and 2 make 4. The whole, W-H-O-L-E, is greater than the part. And I want to assure you, any of you tonight who are doubting this, these are both right, okay? But here's my question to you. Does this give you a reason to get up in the morning? You see, does this bring sunshine into your light? Does it answer those big questions of meaning? No, that's the issue. These are right. There's another one, chemical and water, H2O, which I'm benefiting from at the moment. But look at this. What can you not talk about? Well, let's give some examples. Any moral, political, or religious ideas. Life has a meaning, even before you get to the question, and the meaning is this. Any notion of what's good or bad, there is a God, there isn't a God. I mean, the key point I'm making is simply this. Let me use technical language. The epistemic tragedy of humanity is that the things that really matter to us lie beyond proof, and we have to trust them, even though we know we can give good reasons for saying they're right. In other words, the problem we have as human beings is that we know there are certain things that matter, we believe they're right, and they change the way in which we live. And each of you, if you thought about, could give me a list of 3 or 4 things which are in this category for you. Dawkins would say you have to give those up. Lewis would say, no. You need to show why you think those things, but it's okay, because that's just the situation we have to confront through being human beings. So that's one broad area, which is really interesting. Clearly, I've opened up lots of issues, but time isn't on our side. Let's look at the next one. Does science disprove God? And Dawkins is very, very clear that science makes God both unnecessary and incredible. That in the end, a scientific explanation is always going to win out, and that the progress of science always entails the retreat of faith. And again, going back to that point you made earlier, that science proves its assertions, whereas religious just asserts them. So Lewis basically takes a slightly different perspective. Science is provisional. It's on a journey. It hasn't reached its end. The process of induction, in other words, we hear all these observations, therefore you tease out this big picture by looking at these observations, simply doesn't deliver the certainty that many seem to crave. And that, of course, is David Hume's point, for those of you who are doing philosophy. And his argument also that Christianity is able to give an intellectual framework that helps to make sense of the scientific enterprise and its successes, but also helps us understand the limits of science. So a good example of this change in thinking in science is the shifts in cosmology. And let me give you a quote from 1906. This is from a Swedish writer called Arrhenius and his 1906 bestseller, Worlds in the Making. And this is the consensus of 1906. The universe in its essence has always been what it is now. Matter, energy, and life have only varied as a shape and position in space. That seems very strange to us now, but that was the consensus, and it shifted. And you all know that Hubble and others have really forced us to think in terms of a Big Bang, talking about cosmic origination. And of course, suddenly the religious language of creation begins to look a lot more interesting and plausible, although origination and creation, I must add, are not the same. And interestingly, there's a lot of atheist hostility towards the Big Bang. For example, the astronomer Fred Hoyle said it sounded far too religious, and in fact he was worried that if the Big Bang was right, people would start going to church on Sundays. So you can figure out where he's coming from. Or Steven Weinberg, this is a great quote from 1967. He talked about Hoyle's steady state theory. In other words, there's always been a universe, just varies locally. It's philosophically the most attractive because it least resembles the account given in Genesis. In other words, the first book of the Bible. But then he added these words. It's a pity that the steady state theory is contradicted by experiment. So food for thought there, I think. What's interesting is that in 1948 in England, there was a massive debate between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston about the question of God. And this is a big question. It's about, do we need God to stabilize morality? Well, Copleston won that part of the argument. But do we need God to explain the universe? Well, Russell simply said, the universe has always been here. There's nothing to explain. And won that part of the debate hands down. But in the replay of that in 1998, William Lane Craig, a Christian, was pitted against Anthony Flew, an atheist. And on that point, do we need God to explain the universe? Flew found it very difficult to account for the origins of the universe without implicitly acknowledging the idea of a God. And Flew actually gave up on his atheism as a result, but he embraced what I would have to describe as a rather curious religious view as a result of that. But let me try and make a point which is really important. Dawkins believes that scientific explanation trumps everything. And my question to you tonight is, look, scientific explanations are great, but what if they're only part of the picture, not the total picture? So I'm going to ask you to imagine something. This is the geologist Frank Rhodes, who went on to be president of Cornell University in the States. And he says, look, I want you to imagine a kettle is boiling. And I'm trying to help you a little bit here, okay? Okay. Now, here is his question to you. Why is that kettle boiling, okay? So he says, well, obviously one explanation is scientific, that in effect we're talking about energy conversion, raising the temperature of water to boiling point, and as a result, the latent heat evaporation is absorbed, and water is turned to steam. And of course, that's right. There's more that needs to be said, but that's right. But then Rhodes says, but you know, there's another reason. I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. So I want you to think about this. If explanation 1 is conversion of energy, explanation 2 is making a cup of tea, does explanation 1 invalidate explanation 2? No. Does explanation 2 invalidate explanation 1? No. They're both explanations that are part of a bigger picture. And that's the point that Rhodes is trying to make, that our world, our universe is so complex that you need multiple levels of explanation to make sense of it. And some of this is scientific, but not all of it. Here's Rhodes talking on his own point. These are different answers, but both are true, both are complementary, not competitive. One answer is appropriate within a particular frame of reference, the other within another frame of reference. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. So what I'm saying to you is that certainly there are scientific explanations, but there are others. And the advance of science doesn't invalidate the others. That's the point. And so we come to the third point, which is about meaning. And in many ways, we're going back now to the whole question which we began this lecture. And, you know, we're talking about human beings, why we matter, what we're all about. And of course, it's astonishingly easy to adopt reductionist approaches to humanity. You'll find people saying, we are just atoms and molecules, as if somehow focusing on the lowest element of our identity determines what the identity is. And I think that's just absolute nonsense. Well, let me give you an example. This is a very nice water jug. It's made up of atoms and molecules. I am made up of atoms and molecules, and all of you are too. Now, if you cannot tell the difference between a human being and that, then there's something very seriously wrong with your way of thinking. And you see the point I'm trying to make? Sure, we're all made of atoms and molecules, but there is so much more that needs to be said. In other words, you're reducing human nature to one element when there is so much that more needs to be said. Or Dawkins, for example, says our sole purpose is to reproduce our genes, thus reducing human significance to the level of our components. But there are these existential issues. And really, I could summarize the point I'm going to make by saying we don't just want to know how things work. We need to know what they mean. Or to make this even more focused, we don't just want to know how we work, although that's important. We want to know what we mean. And you could say that science is very, very good at taking things to bits so we can see how they work, but you need something to put everything back together again and show what they mean. Analysis, synthesis. So what I'm suggesting to you is maybe we can think of there being a big picture, like Lewis, and science is part of that big picture and a very important part of that big picture. But it doesn't fill in the full big picture. And maybe we need to bring in material from somewhere else to help us to do that. There's that quote I gave you, Winston, but here's Albert Einstein, really interesting, talking about morality. Science can only ascertain what is, not what should be. And outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. Judgments. And again, the dilemma. You can't prove these, but you have to make these judgments as a matter of faith. So let me introduce a Spanish philosopher I enjoy reading. And this is an essay he wrote, in effect reflecting on why science was so good, and at the same time, why we needed more to lead meaningful lives. Scientific truth, he writes, is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. And that phrase, ultimate questions, of course, comes from the philosopher Karl Popper. These are questions, he says, science can't answer, but we always ask them because they matter so much to us. We want to get them on the table and try and give as good an answer as possible. He goes on and says we're given no escape from these ultimate questions. They're In us, whether we like it or not, scientific truth is exact, but it is incomplete. And that, I think, is a useful way of thinking about the relationship between science and religion. A big picture, neither complete in itself, but each building up to give you a richer and deeper vision of things. Now, many of you will know this quote from Richard Dawkins. This is from his book, A River Out of Eden, and he's talking about the way he sees the purpose of the universe. The universe we observe, he writes, has precisely the properties we'd expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And it's a very powerful quote. What I want you to note is he's saying, I look at the universe and it's consistent with no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, and so on. It's not about proof. It's simply, I see this as being consistent. It's a judgment about the nature of the universe. And my point is simply that there are other ways of looking at it. If I could give you the analogy of a lens that I used earlier, what happens if Dawkins is looking at the world through a lens that's out of focus? Maybe there are other lenses that he could use instead. Now, Lewis is very opposed to reductionism. And many of you will know his novel, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in which a boy meets an older man, and the old man asks Eustace, what is a star? He says, well, in our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. And here's what the old man says in response. Even in your world, my son, that's not what a star is, but only what it's made of. And I want to say that's important. You and I are made up of stuff, but that's not what we are. That's just what we're made of. And you and I transcend our physical, biological, chemical origins. And that's really important, because that means when you ask questions about meaning, we're able to go beyond the empirical and reach into the realm of value, of identity, of agency, and of course, purpose. So Lewis talked a lot about stories. I'm running out of time, so I haven't much time to talk about these. But one of the points that Lewis is making is that in the end, we have to decide which stories we can trust. And for example, in Narnia, you may remember the children go into the strange world. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they hear different stories about it. Some are saying it's really the realm of the White Witch. Others saying, no, it's the realm of Aslan, the noble lion. When he comes back, everything will be different. And you and I find ourselves forced to ask, which narrative do we trust? And you can see immediately that really raises this question of how we become part of a bigger story. Listen to this. For Lewis, faith is about allowing your own story to become part of a bigger story. It's all about that connecting up with something bigger, which in effect means that we see ourselves not as meaningless and isolated, but rather as part of something that really matters, and we can do something with it. And that, I think, is very important. So we begin to wrap up. This is Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine back in the 1960s. And in a book he wrote at the end of his life called The Limits of Science, he, in effect, does exactly what that title suggests. Says science is wonderful, but it does have its limits. And he tries to identify what those limits are. He says we need to acknowledge there are questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. And questions that are in this category include, why am I here? What is good? And of course, what is the point of life? So basically, what I'm saying to you is that if science has limits, there is no criticism of science whatsoever. It's simply allowing science to be science and not become a philosophy of life. So I'm going to end now by looking at a book that I haven't signposted in this lecture, and it's Alex Rosenberg's book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And Rosenberg takes the view that science is able to answer all our questions. It is the only reliable source of knowledge, and therefore if science cannot give an answer, there is no answer that can be given. So what I'm going to do is just quote from his book and explore this with you. And here we go. First question, is there a God? No. Okay, that's settled. Next, what is the nature of reality? Well, it's what physics says it is. Okay, that's, again, very straightforward. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. Okay, again, what's the meaning of life? Ditto, same thing. And again, this is simply saying, if science cannot answer the question, there isn't an answer. It's an invention. And then, look at this. And this is really something that troubles me deeply. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? His answer, there's no moral difference between them. Now, I found myself deeply troubled by that. I wish he had written something else. I wish he had written, science is unable to discern a moral difference between them. Because I could say that's right. But what he's saying is there is no moral difference between them. So here's my question to you as I close. If you're like me and think Rosenberg is wrong, then where do you get your ideas of right and wrong, good and bad from? Because in effect, these are judgments. These are decisions that you make, I'm sure, in a very informed way. But it's not an empirical thing. It's not a rational thing. It's about a way of looking at the world that, in effect, very often what we think the world is like shapes what we think is good and what is evil. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, I think we can conclusively agree I haven't settled anything. but I hope you've enjoyed the ride. And I hope you'll feel that actually opening up these questions for wider discussion really does give you lots of ideas. Perhaps a framework in which science fills in part of the big picture of life, maybe religion another part, but whatever it is, I hope you'll agree these questions are really interesting, they're really worth asking, and I'm so glad there's a center here in Hong Kong that's actually encouraging you to talk about these things. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.
Professor, why are you doing this, bringing science and religion together for a large part of your life? Like what you have mentioned now, you are giving meaning. You're trying to give meaning to the two disciplines. You try to bring these two disciplines together, but why? Why do we need to do that? Why is that good? Is there anything good about that? I ask this because in Andrew's Common Core course, undergraduate science and religion here in HKU, I have one student asking me on your textbook, which we pretty much rely on. so the student asks, oh, Professor McGrath actually claims that he encourages a dialogue approach between science and religion. However, he also observes that in every discussion of history, like the Galileo incident or the Newton, you often conclude with a convergence of pretty much bringing together science and religion in one single reality. So he's asking, you are actually making use of the disguise of dialogue, conversation, but you are actually trying to achieve convergence every time. So I can't answer his question. This is not what I can handle, and I would like to know your answer now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, well, thank you. I'm very happy to answer the question. I don't think everything points towards convergence. There are clearly points at which there is divergence. There are clearly points at which there is synergy. But the point is it's through a dialogue, a discussion, that you actually figure out what the tensions are, what the possibilities of synergy are. And therefore, it's a complex picture. And the danger is that you simplify a complex picture and you reduce it to a single narrative. And that really is my concern about the new atheism. It very much reduces the interaction of science and religion to a single narrative. Why do I think that this is important? Well, let me give you what I think is the beginnings of an answer. It's a very good question, and it needs a very full answer. But here is what I think is right. I think that basically science and religion are two massive elements in our culture. And the difficulty is that very often they go in quite different ways. And both of them talk about similar things. For example, many scientists would say that science is about a quest for deeper patterns beneath what we observe in the world. Is there a bigger picture which actually helps us to make sense of these observations? And actually religion too is also asking questions about a bigger picture as well. And in my own case, my own personal history was actually part of this desire to make those connections. Because when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, about 16 or 17, I loved science. It was absolutely wonderful, and it really was the lodestar of my life. But it seemed to me that science entailed atheism. And then when I began to review that judgment, realizing it wasn't quite that straightforward, but still doing science at university, I began to realize that perhaps I need to revisit that judgment about atheism versus Christianity. And if Christianity were right, then clearly I have to reopen this question. Is sort of a science a compartment in my mind and religion a different compartment, they never interact? Or is there some way in which there can be a conversation between them? So in many ways, my own personal development actually made that particularly important to me. But it's not just, this is the way I see it, this is the way everybody sees it. It's much more this realization that this quest for meaning, which I highlighted right at the beginning of this lecture, is really important for people. And that meaning is a very complex phenomenon. And that science certainly helps understand some things, but not all. And so going back to that image that I used of a big picture, obviously, the analogy might be wrong, but if it's right, it gives you this idea of science helping us with some areas, but not with them all. And therefore, either we shut down discussion about the other sides of things, or we try and find other ways of answering them. So for me, this is very much about opening up a wider discussion. And actually, if I could use an artistic analogy, it's about, in effect, having colors on a palette. And in order to render the complexity, the texture of life and its quest for meaning, we need multiple research methods and multiple resources. And so I'm not limiting this to science and religion, because I think philosophy and art have very important roles in the human quest for meaning and so on. But certainly for me, getting a serious conversation between science and religion underway is very important. To me, that has the potential for enrichment. But of course, at points it will also, I think, highlight tensions as well. But the dialogue, like any dialogue between human beings, is always worth undertaking. And I'm very happy to take that risk. Thank you.
Other questions? There's a question here in the front there.
Yes, thank you very much for this nice talk. But I think in your talk, you're just saying that, of course, science do not provide the answer of meaning of life, and that's why we need religions. However, we also know that in reality, there are many religions in this world, not only Christianity, also Islam and also others, right? So, and different religions certainly provide different versions of meaning of lives. So how can we distinguish any one of them?
Thank you.
And also how the science can maybe helpful to this distinguishment. Okay,
I think that's very true. And certainly there's a multiplicity of religions, so therefore we have to begin to ask questions about how we might make evaluations. And actually also, I mean, when you begin to look at the philosophy of science, you realize very quickly that there are multiple ways of understanding what science is, the status of its achievements and things like that. So again, we very often find we have to make judgments there about whether we see science as in effect uncovering a deeper structure of reality or imposing a socially determined structure on reality due to the interests of power groups. So there's some really interesting questions to be asked there. What I would say is this: I think that we all have to make judgments about which way of looking at things is best. And in my own case, clearly, I've come to the conclusion that Christianity does give this, I use the phrase, big picture, which I think is really interesting. But I'm not trying to impose that judgment on anyone. I'm just saying that's a judgment I came to. But I think you probably, therefore, want me to say, well, look, can you tell us something that maybe Christianity offers that is distinct from what others offer? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable point. And let me give you one example, because religions are different. I mean, the word religion it's not a good word. It's actually a word invented by Westerners in the 18th century to describe cultural phenomena in the East they didn't really understand. And the only word they could think of for using it was religion. So it wasn't actually all that helpful. But in my case, here's what I think. And when I was an atheist, I thought, not only there is no God, but even if there was a God, I mean, so what? Because I'm here in space and time, okay? And God's up there in heaven or somewhere way distant. And he's up there, I'm down here, so it makes no difference to me at all what's up there. And then I began to discover this Christian idea called incarnation. It's this idea that God enters into this world in order to be present with us, to redeem us, and so on. It's about the Word becoming flesh, to use a very characteristic phrase in John's Gospel. And the thought went through our mind, if that is right, that's a game changer. Because it means, in effect, I'm not thinking about God who's sort of way up there, an indifferent spectator on a distant balcony, but rather someone who actually comes into where we are and, in effect, is therefore with us and knows what it's like, for example, to experience suffering and all those things as well. So for me, that is my choice. However, let me emphasize that I am immensely respectful of other answers given to those questions. And I think that actually the whole interplay of science and religion does help us actually in the dialogue between religions, because it actually helps understand there may be a difference between Christianity and Islam here, and that actually helps us understand more what's so distinctive about them. So I don't see this as a kind of imperialist attempt, rather an exploratory attempt to try and make sense of things as best we can. And of course, we do make judgments about which the best position is. Thank you.
Question there, there's a lady, and then there's a question at the back as well. So is there a question there?
So I'm going to refer to your example on Rhodes, the kettle. There's two frameworks, there's two ways to look at why a kettle is boiling. One relies on physics, that's their framework, and everyone's aligned. If we take the faith approach, I know like you spent most of the lecture talking about the science approach. If we were to take the faith approach, what framework would you suggest we look at it, and how do we make sure that we are aligned so that we actually approach this problem with the same type of maybe consensus as they do when they use physics?
Well, I think, that's a really good question. And I love the idea of a consensus in physics. But I have to say, when I specialized in quantum theory at Oxford many years ago, there were very divergent schools of interpretation of quantum theory. And as you will know, they were all empirically equivalent. So actually, it was quite difficult to make a judgment between them. So I think there's perhaps greater variety in physics than one might be inclined to think at points. But your question is good. Let me go back to one of the points I made earlier, which is this transition from thinking the universe has always been there to, in effect, the universe came into being. And the question I'm going to ask to interact with you, which is a very good question, by the way, is this. What is the difference between a scientific narrative of origination and a religious narrative of creation? Because they're clearly different, but on the other hand, there's some kind of isomorphism, some sort of parallelism between them. And in many ways, what I'd want to say is that a scientific narrative of origination is very much about the chronology, the sequence of events, how this actually happened. And I think that's extremely important in helping us to understand, for example, some aspects of our universe, a lot of things to explore there. A religious narrative about creation actually isn't prioritizing things like chronology. It's much more saying, what is the deeper meaning of this universe that we inhabit? And how can we live authentic lives within it? And it uses the narrative of creation, in effect, to say, not simply this universe had an origin. I mean, at present, science would agree with that, although, of course, I can't predict what scientists will say a century from now. But the narrative of creation is not simply a replication of that narrative. It's much more about saying that in some way God is involved in this, and therefore to look at, for example, the beauty of this world around us is to see something of the beauty of God reflected in it. So if you like, we have, I used the language of enrichment earlier, we could think of that, but one of my favorite verses in the Old Testament is Psalm 19, verse 1. And it goes like this, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And actually, in one sense, that is encouraging us to scientifically investigate the heavens, to do astronomy. But at the same time, it's also saying that the more you appreciate the complexity and the beauty of our universe, the more you indirectly begin to appreciate the beauty and complexity of God. So for me, if you like, it's almost as if this idea of two narratives is giving you a religious motivation for doing science, not just because science is interesting, which it certainly is, but also because it makes you feel that you're actually getting to know more about God by looking at the created order itself. Now, clearly, I would need to say a lot more than that, but that's the beginnings of an answer I would give. And if I had a full lecture, I think I could do a better job of it. But thank you very much for asking it.
There's a question back there.
You mentioned that Dawkins wrote at least one thing decades ago that he perhaps regretted later. However, in recent years, he wrote on Twitter that a woman who was pregnant with a Down syndrome fetus should have an abortion. He wrote that's the logical scientific thing to do. I wonder if you would respond to that in the context of the meaning of life debate between science and faith.
Well, I remember that tweet. I don't do Twitter, okay. Do you call this a tweet? Tweet, okay, right, okay. I heard of that tweet, and I thought this is simply a misreading. And then I checked it, and it wasn't. I think it was very, very unwise. I think that it was pastorally really insensitive. I think that basically I have friends who've struggled with this dilemma, and it belittled the existential anguish they felt in trying to make a right decision here. I think it's probably fair to say that Richard Dawkins is perhaps an example of someone who has been mastered by Twitter rather than someone who actually has mastered it. And I think that really it shows how what sounds like a very slick scientific answer actually doesn't really engage the deeper questions of value and meaning that are going on there. So I have to say, I think he was very, very unwise in doing that, and he lost a very substantial amount of support in saying that, and I think rightly so. And interestingly, I mean, my friends at Oxford, who are scientists, were really angry about that, because they said this portrays science as being dehumanizing and uncaring, and they were really cross with him. I would share that. I mean, it's possible to be able to say, look, on scientific grounds, there is perhaps an obvious answer to this, but it's not that simple, because we have to take people seriously as individuals, try and love them, try and respect them, try and help them arrive at a good outcome. So I have to say, I found that really quite disturbing and upsetting. So I guess by asking the question, you probably feel the same way, but it was an example of something that Dawkins said that was very, very unwise. And I'm afraid there are other examples we could give, but I mean, if I can put it like this, I think perhaps as he gets older, maybe he doesn't think enough before saying certain things. And I'm getting older too. So, I probably will end up making similar mistakes, but I wouldn't dare say anything like that in that situation, because that is frankly a dehumanizing approach to a very complex question. Thank you.
Other questions? The gentleman over there who doesn't look like a student have already asked my question. Oh, I already asked a question. There's a question. Oh, there's a question here, is there? Yeah. There's a mic coming.
But you are giving us the picture of science is Dawson's science. But there are other sciences, like psychology. They are actually investigating moral issues. So you are depicting the independence of science and religion is because you are focused on Dawkins science or hard science.
Well, thank you for that. Obviously, in talking about Dawkins and Lewis, that in fact determined my focus. But supposing I were to say, well, let's talk about Kenneth Pargament and other people like Crystal Park. These are prominent psychologists who are looking at these. If I brought them into the picture, I think what they would have said is something like this, that from a psychological perspective, meaning is really important to people. It seems to generate some sort of well-being, some kind of personal stability. And we can draw a distinction, I think, between a global system of meaning and what they might call a local way of implementing that meaning in relation to certain situations. So I think they make some very good points there. They also make the point that although you, as a psychologist, you can investigate what people find meaningful, what people find meaningful, it doesn't have the conceptual apparatus to say this is right and this is wrong. In other words, it is very much an attempt to understand the mechanisms by which people find the quest for meaning to be very important, but it doesn't actually answer the question, the meaning of life, for example, therefore is this. It's much more about trying to understand the way in which people arrive at these decisions. So if I had time, I would have talked about that a lot more. I would have talked, I think, also about the very significant trends in psychology and also anthropology about the importance of narratives. In other words, stories by which we live, which actually help us to ascertain meaning, to remember our past, and also to construct our own personal identities. So there's a lot more I could have talked about, and I'm afraid that in many ways my decision to use Dawkins and Lewis as dialogue partners did limit me. But certainly the psychology, empirical psychology, the psychology of religion is opening up some really interesting questions. And certainly for me, they do bring home to us the importance of this question of meaning, which is why right at the beginning I quoted from some psychologists. And if I had more time, I have talked about the importance of positive psychology, which in many ways is beginning to say, look, we need to talk more about things like wisdom and virtue and things like that. Very often psychology focuses on the problems. You know, here are things we need to sort out, but actually it also, I think, helps us think about the really important things in life as well. So thank you for that. We have time, I think, for one more, so we're going to make a judgment about...
You make the judgment, I think.
Oh, I can't see. There's so many
it's very
people here.
I know.
There's a gentleman there with his hand up. Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. You know, for Lewis, or certainly Christianity, the idea of eternity is can be central to meaning, at least for a number in religion. And so, is there anything in science that even vaguely hints at the idea of eternal life or the possibility of it, or does that just bring a schism between a scientist exclusively and somebody, maybe a Christian or somebody?
I think there's several things in your very good question. One of them is whether science would say, in effect, there are certain things we observe in the world which might point towards a transcendent origin or transcendent source. And actually, science doesn't really use that conceptual framework. I think we need to say that. Actually, one of the reasons why science is so successful is, in effect, its use of a naturalizing methodology, which some would say is a kind of form of atheism. It's not really. It's simply saying we just limit ourselves to a method which we apply in certain ways and it's proved to be very reliable, but it doesn't rule out anything beyond itself, but it's very much saying these are the methods we use for investigating reality. But you've raised a great question about the Trinity, and actually, as you raised that question, again, my mind came back to Richard Dawkins, because, you know, he and I do disagree on quite a few things, as you may have picked up tonight. But there's one very good quote he has in A Devil's Chaplain, which came out in 2003. And what he is doing is reflecting on the limits of human reason. He has this lovely line, I'm quoting it now from memory, and I might be inaccurate, but the gist of it is that the human brain was meant to be able to deal with medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds in landscapes. And therefore, actually, there are an awful lot of stuff that's just way beyond the human capacity to understand. And so Dawkins then talks about the mysteries of physics, meaning things are just so deep we can't actually take them in properly. And he's very critical of postmodern philosophers who he thinks actually minimize these. But he makes a very important point there, which is actually our brains, if evolution designed them, are designed to survive. But they seem to be capable of doing a lot more than that, you know, including, you know, figuring out the structure of the universe and wrestling with questions of meaning. And it just seems to me that really illustrates this very important point that sometimes human reason, if we were to use it on its own, might not be able to answer all our questions. And for me, a mystery is something that actually, it's not something that's irrational. It's just something that is too big for us to take in properly. And for me, I think we have to learn to live that. You mentioned Doctrine of the Trinity. In many ways, for Christians, that's simply saying God is too big to be taken in by a human mind. And therefore, if we do take God in, we reduce God. And we end up with an intellectually manageable notion of God, which actually lacks anything of the glory or the majesty or, for example, the Christian experience of God. So I think there are lots of good points there. I think really what I would say is that in many ways, it's not so much science points towards God. I think the scientists wouldn't say that. But it's much more that science discloses an ordered world with certain interesting features. And if you then bring a theistic lens to bear on that, that lens seems, at least to me, to bring that into quite sharp focus. But it's not science proving. It's much more our religious way of thinking begins to make sense of what is there and perhaps also add some extra detail as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had some wonderful questions. The answers haven't been quite as good as the questions in most cases, but I've really enjoyed interacting with you, and thank you very much for coming.
Alister, thank you. Well, we're done for this evening. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Alister, for being so generous. There is not a selfish gene in you.